Happy holidays, everyone. Christmas is upon us, and for most of us, especially here in the US, we have a pretty specific idea of what that means. A Christmas tree glowing in the corner of the room, familiar holiday movies, hot cocoa by the fire, music you've heard every year of your life, wrapped gifts waiting to be opened. It's cozy, it's nostalgic, it feels safe, and sometime in the middle of the night, on December 24th, a strange, immortal man slips into your house to leave gifts for your children, after keeping tabs on them all year. When you stop and think about it, that part alone is already a little unsettling, but the version of Christmas most of us grew up with is a very polished and family-friendly one, because long before Santa became friendly and long before Christmas became gentle, this season belonged to ghosts, witches, and judgment. And the stories told during this time weren't meant to comfort anyone. Across Europe, Christmas folklore didn't just warn children to behave, it threatened them. St. Nicholas wasn't always benevolent. His companions weren't symbolic, and figures like Krampus weren't oddities tacked onto an otherwise cheerful holiday. They made perfect sense in a season built around fear, scarcity, and consequence. Welcome to Darkly Speaking. I'm your host, Alex Kern, and tonight, I want to take you back to the darker version of Christmas, the one shaped by pagan tradition, early Christianity, and centuries of folklore passed down, changing slightly with every retelling. Because that's how folklore survives. These stories don't belong to just one place or have one version or just one interpretation. So, if you know a different version of any of these stories, let me know down in the comments what version you grew up with. I'd love to hear about it. And if you're drawn to true crime, dark history, and unsettling folklore, then you're in the right place, because I release new episodes every Monday on chilling and unsettling stories from the world of true crime to the eerie realms of the paranormal. I also release video episodes every week on Spotify and YouTube. So for today, I'm calling out my audio listeners. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you're traveling for the holidays, please take a second to rate the podcast 5 stars wherever you're listening. And of course, wherever you are, don't forget to follow, like, subscribe, all the things. All right, without further ado, let's begin. Christmas wasn't always a gentle holiday wrapped in hymns and candlelight. For centuries, it resembled something closer to Halloween than anything sacred, a winter season steeped in masks, mischief, and rituals meant to keep the darker parts of the world at bay. Early Christmas carried a pulse of something feral beneath it. People gathered around fires, telling ghost stories, performing quiet charms to ward off witches and wandering spirits, and throwing themselves into dangerous party games, including one where partygoers literally tossed flaming raisins into their mouths just to prove they could. Bands of mummers roamed from house to house, faces hidden behind masks, soot, or cross-dressed costumes. They demanded food, drink, or entry, caused trouble when they felt like it, and often collapsed into drunken revelry on the floors of homes that hadn't invited them in the first place. Christmas was a season defined by noise, inversion, and misrule, a winter carnival that blurred identity and dissolved restraint. That wildness eventually reached a breaking point. Christmas gained such a reputation for chaos and criminality that authorities stepped in to shut it down. In 1659, the Massachusetts General Court did something almost unimaginable today. They criminalized Christmas. Anyone caught celebrating it could be fined. Across the colonies and early United States, the holiday was rarely recognized and often deliberately ignored. Most states wouldn't legally acknowledge Christmas until the mid-1800s after a deliberate cultural effort to rehabilitate it into something respectable. It was as if society was trying to silence a creature it had accidentally unleashed. And even among Christians, the holiday raised suspicion. Devout believers, especially Puritans, argued there was no biblical evidence Jesus was even born on December 25th. If God had wanted the nativity honored, they said, Scripture would have provided the date. Many early Christians outside Puritan circles shared the same discomfort. Christmas felt theologically flimsy and culturally indulgent, like a festival wearing the wrong skin. But instead of abolishing the holiday, the church made a strategic choice. In the 4th century, they placed Christ's birthday on December 25th, not because it fit biblical history, but because it aligned perfectly with solstice festivals people refused to give up. The unspoken deal was simple. You can keep your solstice traditions, the feasting, the drinking, the noise, the mischief, just redirect them toward a Christian celebration. Say it's Jesus' birthday. People agreed and then continued celebrating exactly as they had before. For centuries, Christmas remained a carnival more than a religious observance, a holy day grafted onto a far older, rowdier root system. That root system shaped more than rituals, it shaped social order. Christmas was one of the rare times when class barriers dissolved. The poor could burst into wealthy homes, demanded food or ale, mock authority figures, and even steal without much consequence. A child could be appointed bishop for a day, presiding over ceremonies and issuing proclamations adults were expected to obey. Early carols weren't gentle hymns, they were confrontational, sometimes even threatening. And if a homeowner refused hospitality or offered too little, their property could be vandalized. Christmas was a holiday ruled by the upside down, where the powerless briefly held dominion. By the 1700s, American congregations attempted to tame the chaos. They promoted a more pious version of Christmas. Keep the holiday, they said, but strip away the violence and excess. Encourage religious observance, soften the celebration, and introduce new hymns and compositions that reframed Christmas as reflective rather than riotous. It was the first coordinated attempt to impose order on a tradition that had long resisted control. But the true reinvention came in the 1800s. Before then, Christmas was treated like any other workday. Many churches didn't even hold services. The 19th century, however, changed everything. Writers, artists, newspapers, and early advertisers began shaping Christmas into the family-centered, sentimental holiday we recognize today. Ironically, it wasn't the church that accomplished this transformation. It was secular culture. Modern conversations about a war on Christmas overlook that secular influence is the only reason the holiday survived the church's earlier attempts to suppress it. Christmas was rebuilt the way Victorians loved to rebuild things, with sentiment, nostalgia, and just enough ghost story atmosphere to feel timeless. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Christmas was something that needed rescuing. Its reputation as a season of chaos, misrule, and public disorder still clung to it, shaped by centuries of drunkenness, rowdy crowds, and traditions that authorities had once tried to stomp out entirely. The holiday didn't simply drift back into favor on its own, it was deliberately rebuilt. What Christmas needed were new stories that could soften its rough edges without stripping away the darkness that had always lived beneath the season. One of the most powerful forces behind that revival was A Christmas Carol. When Charles Dickens wrote the story, he was struggling financially and professionally. Publishers initially rejected it, unwilling to take a risk on what they saw as a strange moral ghost tale. Dickens used his own limited money to publish it himself, and against all odds, the story became a sensational success. It didn't just sell, it reshaped how Christmas was imagined. And crucially, Dickens didn't save the holiday by making it brighter. He saved it by letting it stay dark. His Christmas was crowded with ghosts, threats, and moral reckoning. The dead returned, the future loomed, fear became a teacher. In doing so, Dickens carried forward a much older tradition, the Christmas ghost story. Audiences responded because they recognized something familiar. Christmas had always made room for the eerie. Dickens worked because, well, he understood what the season actually needed. People never wanted Christmas scrubbed clean of its shadows. They wanted those shadows given meaning. His story didn't turn fear into chaos, it turned fear inward, into reflection. Christmas could still be unsettling, still haunted, still capable of dread. But now that darkness served a different purpose. It reformed instead of destroyed. In Dickens' hands, the old unease of winter nights wasn't outlawed, it was repurposed. Still, beneath all that reinvention, the Puritans had been right about one thing. Christmas was built on a pagan foundation. Many of the symbols we now consider quintessentially Christmas, the trees, the greenery, the Yule logs, the seasonal fires, come directly from pre-Christian solstice traditions, rituals meant to survive the longest night of the year. Modern Christmas is beautiful, warm, and bright, but it's also haunted by what came before. And if you want to see those older rituals still alive today, you don't have to look far, because, well, they've been invited inside, standing quietly in our living rooms and hanging by the hearth each winter, in the evergreen trees we dress and the stockings we leave like offerings. Long before Christmas had a name, before churches or carols or nativity scenes, there was a story rooted in the ancient world, one that begins not with celebration but with obsession, grief, and devotion taken too far. Sybil was a powerful mother goddess, tied to mountains, wild places, and the untamed force of nature itself. Attis was her young lover, bound to her not just by affection but by fate. But the myth turns darker. Attis fell in love with the mortal woman and stood at the altar prepared to marry her, when Sybil arrived in a fury. Terrified, Attis fled into the dense forest, running through towering pines as Sybil used her powers to unravel his mind. Madness took hold, and in his delirium, Attis mutilated himself, severing his own penis, and, not long after, collapsed beneath a pine tree where he died. His blood soaked into the earth at its roots. When Sybil found him, her grief was overwhelming. In her mourning, it was said, she transferred Attis's soul into the pine itself, binding him to the tree and making her lover eternal. And that, my friends, is how the pine became evergreen, living through every winter untouched by decay. Sybil's sorrows was believed to shake the land, and the tree was transformed into a symbol of eternal life, a promise that, even in death, something could endure, something could return. In later ritual belief, cutting down the pine was understood as an echo of Attis's final act, the tree's fall mirroring the violence done to his own body. From that moment on, the pine was no longer just a tree. It was sacred, mourned, honored, feared, a silent witness to sacrifice, devotion, and loss. From the very beginning, evergreens were bound to death and to the promise that life could return. That belief didn't belong to just one culture alone. Long before Christmas trees existed, ancient civilizations across Europe brought evergreen branches into their homes during the winter solstice as part of pagan ritual practice. Romans, Germanic tribes, and countless northern cultures clung to greenery as proof that life endured even as the world seemed to die. The solstice marked the longest night of the year, a moment thick with fear, uncertainty, and hope. And evergreens became symbols of rebirth, continuity, and protection against the cold and the unseen forces believed to move freely through the winter darkness. Green against a dying landscape wasn't decoration, it was defiance. These branches carried spiritual weight. Evergreens weren't neutral objects. They were believed to protect homes, encourage fertility, promise rebirth, and ward off evil. Those meanings existed centuries before Christianity, and when Christianity spread, they didn't vanish, they lingered. The symbols remained, quietly resisting erasure. In Germany, that resistance took a familiar shape. Evergreen trees began appearing indoors during winter celebrations, decorated with candles, apples, and handmade ornaments. These early trees blended older pagan symbolism with emerging Christian meaning, creating a tradition that felt intimate and ritualistic rather than overtly religious. German settlers carried this practice with them to America, but for a long time it remained regional, strange, and misunderstood. Everything changed in the 19th century. Queen Victoria, who grew up watching her German mother decorate Christmas trees each winter, and her German-born husband, Prince Albert, brought the evergreen into the public eye in Britain. An illustrated image of the royal family gathered around a decorated evergreen spread widely, and with it, the tree was transformed. From foreign to fashionable, from pagan suspect to respectable, sentimental, and safe. Britain's cultural influence carried that image across the world, and the evergreen followed. In the United States, adoption came slowly. Despite German settlers practicing the tradition for generations, most Americans initially rejected Christmas trees as strange, pagan, or outright unchristian. But by the mid to late 1800s, attitudes shifted. Urbanization, immigration, and Victorian ideals of home and family reframed the trees as a symbol of domestic warmth. What had once been feared was welcomed indoors, placed at the center of the home. Today, the Christmas tree is framed as cheerful and nostalgic, but historically it stood for survival, rebirth born from death, endurance through the longest nights. A living tree brought inside during a season defined by decay. It is a quiet relic of older beliefs, still standing. But the tree wasn't the only object that took on meaning during those long nights. While it stood watch in the corner of the room, the hearth told a different story. Near the fire, where warmth meant survival, clothing was hung to dry, left close to heat, practical and unremarkable at first. Over time, those garments would become symbols of expectation, hope, and judgment. And that is where the next tradition begins. When people picture Santa Claus, they imagine snow, a white beard, red wool, and northern cold. Strip all of that away, and what remains is something far older and far stranger. St. Nicholas wasn't a man of the north. He was actually Greek, born and raised in the Mediterranean world, surrounded by sun, salt air, and stone cities. He lived in warmth, not snow. His beard would likely have been dark, not white. He was not jolly, he was intense, a man shaped by deprivation and devotion rather than comfort. And while it's said that he did go through chimneys, it was never to deliver toys. His miracles were not gentle. Many of them were actually deeply unsettling. Nicholas earned his sainthood through acts that hovered at the edge of violence and death. Long, long ago, 3 young boys set out together on the road to Athens, traveling with the hope and naivete of boys who believed the world would meet them fairly. Somewhere along that road, they vanished. Families waited for their sons to return, but that day never came. Rumors spread, and Nicholas, moved by the quiet suffering left in their absence, knew he could not turn away. He searched for them day and night, walking the roads, asking questions, following fragments of stories that led nowhere. One cold winter night, exhaustion eventually overtook him, and knowing he could not continue in the dark, he stopped at an inn to rest and begin again at first light. He knocked, waited, and after a long moment, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, half framed by the dim interior, his body twisted by old injuries that time had never corrected. One leg trailed uselessly behind him, scraping faintly against the threshold as he shifted his weight. His face bore the evidence of past violence, scars pulled tight across skin that had healed without care, leaving his features uneven and strained. His clothing sagged from his frame, darkened with damp and age, clinging as though it had grown there. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat politeness of someone going through a practiced motion, hospitality offered not from warmth, but obligation. The door opened wider. The air that followed was heavy and wet, carrying a sourness that filled the space between breaths. It pressed outward from the inn, thick enough to dull the cold night beyond it. Whatever lived inside had been kept close to the fire for too long. Nicholas crossed the threshold. Near the hearth, boots and cloaks hung in careful rows, turned inward toward the heat. They looked recently worn, recently placed. He told himself the inn was busy, that travelers must have arrived just ahead of him. It was easier to believe that than wonder where their owners had gone. Sleep found him late, and when it did, it came without rest. Nicholas slipped into a nightmare that did not feel imagined, but revealed. The inn returned to him in suffocating detail. He saw the 3 boys arrive together, cloaks damp from travel, voices low with fatigue and relief. He watched them settle into their beds and drift off to sleep. Then the darkness shifted. From the corner of the room, the innkeeper emerged, moving closer to the beds, the floorboards betraying him with soft groans. The room seemed to close in. Terrible violence followed. Blows struck where sound would not carry, metal biting flesh, blood spattering on the walls and the sheets of the bed. Their bodies stilled, one by one, until the room fell unnaturally quiet. Nicholas felt it as if he were standing there himself, helpless and awake inside the vision. When he finally jolted upright, his chest burned and his hands trembled. He knew with sick certainty he had not been shown a dream, but an evil truth. He woke in the middle of the night, summoned the innkeeper, and confronted him. As Nicholas prayed with all his might, a stark bright light suddenly lit up the entire room, blinding the innkeeper. That's when the pickling tub in the corner of the inn opened. The boys' body parts, their arms, hands, legs, slowly began to rise out of the tub and put themselves back together again. They were restored, whole and breathing, as if death itself had been interrupted. Nicholas had brought the boys back to life, fled the inn, and returned them all safely to their families. In another telling passed down across France, 3 small children wandered too far while at play, were lured away, slaughtered by a butcher, and hidden as meat meant for sale. Again, Nicholas appeared. Again, he called upon God. And again, life returned where violence had already taken it. These stories are why Nicholas became known as the patron and protector of children, not because he was comforting, but because he intervened after horror had already occurred. He was a protector, but protection often came through fear. He acted decisively when authority failed, when law collapsed, when God seemed distant. His power wasn't rooted in softness, it came from moral extremity. According to legend, one such intervention began without warning or explanation. Nicholas found himself traveling without a destination at first, guided by a quiet insistence he could not name. He followed it to a coastal city far away from his own home. As he was walking through the busy streets filled with small homes and market stalls, he overheard the townspeople gossip about a man who lost everything. He had 3 daughters and no dowries to offer them. Without that protection, they had no future in the world they were born into. By morning, the father planned to sell them into slavery. The exchange would take place at a brothel the very next day. Nicholas, intrigued and compelled, wandered to the home of the man who lost everything. He lived in a large house near the center of the street, worn by age but unmistakably once prosperous. What held his attention was not the door, but the chimney. Tall, wide, built larger than necessity required. He lingered there longer than he meant to. Nicholas understood immediately, though, that there was no appeal to make and no authority to summon. There was no time. He also knew the man would never accept charity offered openly. Pride, in this case, was as immovable as poverty. Nicholas had very, very little left to spare, but he intended to give it all to this man and save his daughters. He waited until nightfall, wrapping himself in a cloak and a hat to conceal his face. Nicholas returned to the house and kept to the shadows. He did not approach the door. Instead, he climbed the exterior wall, choosing the chimney as the only way inside without being seen. The descent was narrow and punishing. Soot burned his lungs and the space pressed close on every side. When his feet reached the hearth, he brushed against fabric hanging near the fire. The girl's stockings, left there to dry in the warmth. He had not planned for this, but he understood at once. Gold placed openly would invite questions. Gold delivered this way, though, and the stockings would feel like providence. One by one, he emptied his sack into the stockings until nothing remained. He left no note. He spoke no name. Nicholas exited the same way he had entered and waited nearby until morning. When the house finally stirred, he heard voices break into disbelief, then relief. The daughters were spared. The father emerged into the street, clutching gold, offering thanks to God alone, convinced a miracle had occurred. Nicholas watched from a distance, unseen and unnamed, and then moved on. From that moment, the stocking became more than clothing. It became a vessel for mercy, a symbol of judgment deferred, proof that intervention could arrive in the night. The hearth became sacred. The chimney became a threshold between worlds. The historical Nicholas lived between 270 and 343 AD, and his story shifted with every generation that retold it. But certain elements endured: the sack, the chimney, secrecy, moral intervention. Even modern Santa films unknowingly echo this darker origin. By the 1100s, Catholic missionaries carried these stories across Europe. In places like Austria, they encountered existing pagan traditions, winter figures already tied to judgment and inspection. The myths blended. The harsher edges were softened. Stories of child mutilation were mostly left behind. But St. Nicholas wasn't the first to inspect homes in the dead of winter. He was simply the one history chose to remember kindly. Before Santa Claus ever slipped through chimneys with gifts, there was another winter visitor who entered homes when generosity had not yet replaced judgment. Her name was Frau Perchta, a figure rooted in Southern Germanic folklore, remembered not as a giver but as an inspector. She was believed to arrive when no one was watching, moving through households unseen to measure behavior and enforce order. Like Santa, she judged, but where Santa would eventually reward or withhold, Perchta punished, and the consequences were violent and final. She was known as the watcher of households, the punisher of laziness and disobedience, and in later tellings, the belly-slitter. Stories warned that she did not wear a single face. To those who kept their homes in order and followed the rules of winter, she appeared as a beautiful woman, pale and composed, passing through like a blessing. To those who mocked the warnings, well, she came as something else entirely. An old hag or horned figure with iron-like skin, a crooked nose, and one twisting foot dragging behind her as she crossed the threshold. Perchta did not come by whim. Her arrival was fixed to the calendar itself. She appeared on the eve of the winter solstice, later called Perchta's Night or the 12th night of Advent, when nights stretched longest and people believed the boundary between worlds grew thin. Villages lay buried under snow, paths erased, doors sealed against the cold. This was not a night meant for visitors, and yet Perchta came anyway. It was the eve of the winter solstice in rural southern Germany. Snow had been falling for days, piling against the house until the walls groaned under its weight. Beyond the windows, the forest stood black and still. Winter here was dangerous, creeping closer the longer it was ignored. Inside the small wooden house lived a family trying to last through the season. Two sisters stayed near the hearth. Ada sat close to the fire, tracing shapes in the ash with her fingers, careful not to disturb it too much. Greta kicked at straw scattered across the floor and leaned against the loom, tugging at the loose thread until her mother sharply told her to stop. Their parents moved slowly through the room, worn down by cold and work. Their mother remained at the loom, flax drawn tight between her fingers, the shuttle passing back and forth. She needed to keep spinning. Flax meant linen. Linen meant warmth for the long winter. As night came, their mother spoke without ceremony. Tonight was the solstice. Frau Perchta walked on nights like this. She came into houses to look at how they were kept. She checked the work. She checked the children. Their mother described her the same way she had been described for generations. Skin hard like iron, a nose bent out of shape, clothes torn and filthy, and one foot dragging wrong beneath her skirts. She said the rules once and did not repeat them. The flax must be spun, the work finished, an offering left by the hearth. Fresh potato dumplings were made, but there was not enough to feed the family. There was only enough for the offering. The mother set it aside and placed it near the hearth. It was not for them. It was not to be touched. This was for Frau Perchta. Later, the family laid down to rest. The parents, exhausted and hungry, fell asleep quickly. Ada and Greta lay awake longer, their stomachs aching. They were just so hungry. Greta leaned close and whispered that it was only a story, that no one was coming, that winter liked to frighten children. Ada listened and said nothing. She kept still in the dark, awake longer than she meant to be, until sleep finally took her. She woke to her sister, screaming. Ada bolted upright and ran toward the sound. The fire was out. Cold filled the room. Near the hearth, the bowl sat empty, scraped clean. Before she could speak, The noise came rushing in from outside. Bells, hooves, voices laughing and singing. Figures rushed through the door, wearing masks and horns, their bodies wrong and animal-like. The Perchta. Greta screamed again as hands grabbed her. She called for her parents, but no one answered. Ada froze in place. She watched her sister, screaming, kicking, thrashing, begging to be let go as the Perchta forced her down, her own voice locked in her throat, while Frau Perchta entered last through the door. She crossed the room slowly, her presence pressing down on the very space around her. Her gaze moved from the loom to the flax still loose in its frame, then to the empty place by the hearth where the offering should have been. She said nothing. She only smiled, thin and knowing, and glanced at the Perchta, inviting them closer. Greta was dragged forward, crying and pleading for mercy. What followed was slow and sickening. Frau Perchta drew out a heavy pair of iron shears, their blades dull with age and use. Ada could do nothing but watch as the witch, without hesitation, opened Greta from throat to belly and removed what lay inside her, taking it for her solstice feast. Around them, the Perchta rejoiced. They laughed and stomped their feet, clattered to their masks, rang their bells, and celebrated the night as if it were a festival. When the feast was over, the figures closed in around what remained of her. They packed her belly with straw, stones, and shards of broken glass, filling the empty space where her insides had been, and stitched her shut. When they stepped back, Greta no longer resembled a child. What remained was a lifeless, weighted doll, a toy, something made and inhuman. Ada was left where she stood, tears burning her eyes, her mouth opened, but no sound came. Her legs would not carry her anywhere. The figures withdrew, the door shut. The house went still, as if it had never known another sound. By morning, the snow lay smooth around the house, unbroken, untouched, as though the night itself had been wiped clean. Ada's parents woke to find her standing near the hearth, silent and unmoving, and Greta hanging there, heavy and misshapen, left behind for the daylight to discover. People told this story so it would not be forgotten, so the flax would be spun, the offering left untouched, and the long winter endured. Disrespect for winter's rules was corrected by turning the body itself into a warning. Sometimes the punished lived for a time, stiff and silent, carrying whatever had been placed inside them. Other times, they were found cold and bloated by morning, untouched by struggle. What the household discovered at dawn was never explained, and it didn't need to be. This was not treated as a fairy tale. People believed Perchta truly came. They left dumplings, herrings, and porridge on purpose, not as celebration, but as precaution. Children were central to these stories because, well, children meant labor, and labor meant survival. Perchta became a tool of instruction in a world where neglect could be fatal, keeping children from wandering into the wilderness, from predators, from disappearing altogether. Fear standing in for supervision when supervision wasn't possible. In this way, Perchta functioned as a proto-Santa. She arrived at night, she entered homes, she judged behavior, she demanded offerings, she enforced order. In some regions, young men dressed as Perchta or her followers and went door to door demanding food, threatening punishment if refused, a practice that predates modern trick-or-treating. As harvest festivals drifted later into the year, some communities marked both autumn and winter with spirit nights, believing the dead walked during both seasons. When Christianity spread, missionaries reshaped these traditions. October festivals became All Saints' Day. December required a different framework. Figures like Perchta were softened, absorbed, renamed. Her traits were redistributed. Judgment remained, punishment was muted, generosity was emphasized. Early Santa and St. Nicholas folklore still carried fear, but over time, the consequences were stripped away entirely. And where Perchta once entered homes to enforce survival, Santa would arrive to reward obedience instead. As Christmas was rebuilt in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it did not grow gentler by accident. The older versions of the holiday had been loud, public, and confrontational, shaped by traditions of social inversion where poor could demand from the wealthy, mock authority, and force generosity through intimidation. For emerging middle and upper classes, this model became intolerable. The solution was not to erase Christmas, but to redesign it. The holiday was reframed as something smaller and safer, centered not on crowds or class tension, but on children. So generosity was essentially redirected away from public obligation and toward the private sphere of the home, where giving could be controlled, sentimental, and contained. Childhood nostalgia became the engine that kept the holiday alive. Adults began recreating an idealized version of their own past, passing that version forward as tradition. Christmas survived because, well, it became personal, emotional, and repeatable within the family unit. Chaos was exchanged for comfort. Obligation was replaced with memory. Rather than discarding older folklore, this new Christmas recycled it. St. Nicholas had never been a single uniform figure, but a collection of regional traditions spread across Europe. In the Netherlands, he was known as Sinterklaas, already associated with children and gift-giving. These traditions slid neatly into the redesigned holiday. Judgment did not disappear, but it did shrink. Consequences became symbolic instead of severe. Ancient authority was softened and refashioned for modern comfort. In the early 19th century, this transformation took on a distinctly American shape in New York City. The region's history as the former Dutch colony of New Amsterdam meant cultural memory of Sinterklaas already lingered. Washington Irving helped revive and reshape St. Nicholas as the mythical patron of New Amsterdam, introducing him into American popular imagination through satire and pseudo-history. Santa Claus did not emerge organically. He was written into existence. That image was finalized by Clement Clark Moore with the publication of A Visit from St. Nicholas. Moore transformed St. Nicholas from a solemn bishop into a jolly, approachable working-class figure. This Santa was not frightening. He did not judge adults. He posed no threat to social order. Moore himself owned enslaved people and opposed abolition and democracy, and his version of Santa reflects a world built on comfort and stability, one where the hierarchy remained untouched. This was the moment St. Nicholas lost his teeth. Judgment did not vanish, but it narrowed. Santa became an authority over children alone. Adults were released from accountability. Giving turned inward, focused on one's own household. Charity toward the poor became optional, something extra rather than expected. Christmas no longer demanded justice. It required only consumption, nostalgia, and tradition. But not every culture accepted this softened version of winter. Across much of Europe, harsher traditions endured. Santa alone was not enough. A lump of coal carried little weight in societies shaped by Judgment Day, moral consequence, and the fear of divine reckoning. Judgment was not distant or abstract. It could arrive at death, at night, at the door. Where Santa softened, others remained. Europe kept Santa, but gave him companions, figures who enforced what he no longer did. Punishment became physical again. Fear became instructional again. And if Santa rewarded the good, someone still had to deal with the bad. Krampus is usually introduced as the dark twin of Christmas, the horned anti-Santa with chains, claws, and a taste for punishment. By now, his image feels familiar, a monster meant to frighten children into behaving. But that version is already softened. Krampus does not appear on Christmas itself. He does not act alone. He actually was never meant to be understood as a single character. Krampus belongs to the Alpine regions of Austria and southern Germany, and in his earliest form, he was not an individual at all, but a type. There were many Krampuses, in fact, each with different masks, different horns, different shapes, all bound to the same function. He was not a character so much as a role, one that could be filled again and again. Historically, Krampus did not oppose St. Nicholas. He actually accompanied him. Their relationship was not rebellion, but division of labor. St. Nicholas rewarded, Krampus punished. And on the night of December 5th, St. Nicholas Eve, children were judged. Good behavior earned gifts, bad behavior earned something else. Krampus acted with permission. His violence was authorized. The punishments varied by region, but the intent never changed. Some children were beaten with rods, some were dragged through the streets in baskets, some were taken away to places the stories refused to describe clearly. These tales were not designed to be survived comfortably. The details were meant to linger because fear was the lesson. That fear spilled out of homes and into the streets on Krampusnacht. Men donned masks and horns, their faces transformed into snarling beasts. Bells rang, chains clattered, alcohol flowed. Terror became communal. Everyone participated whether they wanted to or not. As Christianity spread, pagan spirits were reclassified and Krampus was reshaped accordingly. His animal features hardened into something demonic. Hooves, claws, and fangs were emphasized. Chains were added, but not as tools of escape, but as symbols of control, held by St. Nicholas to signify Christian authority over older forces. Morality plays reinforced the hierarchy. Krampus was allowed to remain, but only as something bound. It was the eve of St. Nicholas Day in the late 16th century, and the small town in southern Germany was already shaking with noise by the time the sun began to sink. Krampusnacht had taken hold of the streets. Bells rang, chains dragged across stone, and drunken laughter spilled from the square as men in furs and masks ran wild. 13-year-old Matthias was not among them. He stayed away, not out of disinterest, but fear. He met his friends on the road just outside town as they staggered home, flushed with drink and excitement. They talked over one another, describing the parade in breathless detail. Horns curving high above snarling masks, heavy furs soaked with sweat. They laughed as they reenacted the chase, boasting about who had been struck, who had run, and who had screamed. Matthias listened without smiling, his hands cold at his sides, their joy scraping against something deep and raw inside him. Years ago, on the same night, his older brother had vanished. He had gone to the parade, laughing, careless, certain the stories were nothing more than noise and masks. Matthias remembered waking to a house gone strangely quiet, ash and soot scattered near the hearth as if something had passed through it. The fire had burned low, but undisturbed. His brother's shoes were still lying chaotically by the fireplace. The snow outside lay smooth and untouched, as though no one had crossed it at all. His brother had been rebellious, careless, dismissive of warnings. Matthias had never doubted what had taken him. He returned home before dark, shutting the door firmly behind him. The house felt smaller at night, its walls close and watchful. His parents brushed off his unease, telling him it was only men in costumes, old games played too loudly, nothing more. Matthias nodded but did not argue. He stayed away from the windows, he kept his distance from the fire. When he finally lay in bed, he listened to the wind pressing against the house and the distant noise from town slowly dying away. The firelight from the hearth flickered weakly across the ceiling, the only thing that made the darkness tolerable. Every time the lights shifted, he thought of his brother. Then, all of a sudden, the fire grew brighter, not dimmer, not lower, but stronger. The glow sharpened, spilling too far across the room, the warmth turning heavy and close. Matthias sat up, his throat tight, and slid from his bed. A figure stood by the hearth, unmoving, as if he had always been there. He was old in a way that felt deliberate, his posture rigid, his presence heavy with rule and record. A book was pressed to his chest, a staff held upright at his side. Matthias recognized him at once. Relief flickered through him and died just as quickly, smothered by a deeper, colder fear. St. Nicholas raised a hand, stopping Matthias where he stood. This visit, he explained, was not for gifts alone. Deeds had to be weighed. As the words settled, Matthias became aware of another presence, something waiting just beyond the walls. Scratching sounded at the door, heavy breathing followed. Shadows stretched across the room in ways they should not have been able to. Matthias thought of the hearth, of ash and soot, of shoes left behind. The door opened. They were not costumes. The Krampuses filled the doorway, towering and asymmetrical, their bodies wrapped in matted fur slick with dampness and grime. Horns curved and twisted from their skulls at uneven angles, some cracked, some splintered, their faces carved into snarling, tooth-bared expressions that seemed to breathe on their own. Their smell hit first, damp fur, iron, old smoke, and when they moved, it was slow and unavoidable, claws scraping wood as rough hands closed around Matthias's arms and legs before he could even step back. St. Nicholas opened the book and began to read. Good deeds, small sins. Each misdeed was spoken slowly, stacking atop the last until Matthias felt the room closing around him, his body refusing to move, and with every offense the Krampuses shifted, their grip tightening until Matthias could feel claws bite through cloth and skin. He was dragged toward the hearth, and as he looked into it, the fire no longer behaved like fire. It stretched and widened, the dark behind it peeling open as if the stone itself were giving way, revealing a pit of living heat that breathed back at him. Waves of burning air poured over his face and chest, stealing his breath. Each small sin St. Nicholas named drew laughter from the Krampuses, low and wet as they hauled him closer to the opening. Matthias's heart hammered wildly as tears spilled down his face from terror so vast it hollowed him out. He could not explain what he was seeing, only that it was not just flame. It was a place that watched him. He knew with sick certainty that he was staring straight into hell itself. He understood then what had happened to his brother. The hearth was not a place of comfort. It was a door. St. Nicholas spoke again, his voice steady and unyielding. The judgment was not mercy, only reprieve. Matthias would be spared this night, marked for obedience, his fate deferred rather than erased. The Krampuses hissed and shifted, displeased as they loosened their grip. Slowly, unwillingly, they withdrew, chains scraping the floor, their eyes never leaving Matthias until the door closed behind them. He was spared. A few modest gifts were placed in his hands. Relief flickered, thin and fragile. One of the Krampuses gestured as it withdrew, a promise rather than a threat. This was not forgiveness, only postponement. The house fell dark again, the fire dimmed as it always had. Matthias did not sleep. Fear stayed with him long after the night passed. He understood what obedience meant now. Good behavior was not faith, it was survival. Judgment would return next year, and so the cycle continued. In the modern world, Krampus has returned through festivals, tourism, and the internet. The masks are elaborate, the violence is staged, fear has become spectacle again. But the figure persists for a reason. The instinct never disappeared. Krampus remains because, while Christmas never truly lost its monsters, it only learned how to hide them. And that's where I'll leave you, somewhere between Christmas lights and Europe's deeply unhinged little seasonal creatures. And if you're still here, please leave a Christmas tree emoji wherever you're listening. A lot of these hyper-specific holiday figures exist because, well, for a very long time, Christmas wasn't just about warmth or generosity. It was a season tied to ghosts, witches, goblins, the kind of things people genuinely believed wandered closer when the nights grew longer and the cold set in. These stories gave people a way to make sense of that darkness. They weren't just about fear, they were about control, protection, and survival, about putting rules around chaos, about teaching children how to behave, yes, but also about creating rituals that made people feel a little safer during the most dangerous time of the year. And honestly, that's one of the things I love most about dark history. It's not just about uncovering the bleak or unsettling parts of the past, it's about seeing how those traditions bend and adapt so that they don't disappear. Pagan beliefs didn't vanish when Christianity arrived. They changed shape. They slipped into Christmas. And I think that's why these stories still stick with us. Because even now, there's something comforting about having a few rules to follow, a few offerings to leave out, a sense that if you do the right things, eat the right foods, finish your work, mind your behavior, you'll make it through the winter in one piece. Or at the very least, you won't get dragged off to hell by something with horns and claws. Personally, I think the holiday season is a lot more interesting with a little darkness woven in, a little folklore, a reminder that beneath the tinsel and playlists, these traditions were once very real to the people who told them, and passed them down, generation after generation. I'd love to know what kind of holiday traditions you grew up with, or which ones still linger in your family now. And if there's a piece of folklore you want me to dig into next, you know where to find me. You can submit your stories and case requests to darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com, or feel free to head over to our website, darklyspeakingpodcast.com. Next week will be our last Darkly Speaking episode of 2025, so we're shifting gears just slightly into a very cozy and spooky Christmas ghost story. So be sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening so you don't miss out on that. Until then, enjoy the Christmas trees, hang the stockings, and maybe leave something by the hearth, just in case.